Uh, so, if you could grab a seat. As I mentioned earlier, the first time we can start to talk about the New Testament as a single coherent whole is in the 4th century. That's when we start to see technological innovations as well as the church now being able to come together in a more consistent way because the Roman Empire has now given them permission to do so. So under Constantine, Christianity is a permitted religion. It's not actually an official religion until about 5 or 6 decades after Constantine, but it becomes legal in the first part of the 4th century, the 300s. And now the church can come together. You have the Council of Nicaea, right? You know, on Sunday mornings we use the Nicene Creed, which was put together in 325 AD. And about the same time, the church starts to be able to compare notes with each other, bring together in final form what we now call the New Testament. An example of this physically is a book called the Codex Vaticanus. It happens to be today in the Vatican collections, so it's named Vaticanus. But it's a parchment Greek manuscript of the entire New Testament, the entire Old Testament in Greek, and the Apocrypha books, which the Roman Catholic Church later declared to be canonical and on the same status. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. A sister manuscript to this, the Codex Sinaiticus, which is today in the British Library in London. Just a beautiful. Each page is about this big, 4 columns, gorgeous hand. In fact, there were 4 different copyists working at the same time to produce that single book. And their hands their letters are virtually identical. You have to really look to see the differences. So somebody, frankly, spent a lot of money to put together a single book, a single codex here of all the Bible. There's about 380 goat skins and a couple lamb skins that were required to produce the entire Old Testament, New Testament Apocrypha in the Codex Sinaiticus. Think about it, 380 goats had to die to make that book, right? So they didn't buy it at Walmart, right? They didn't get it from Amazon.com. Somebody who had the resources put this together, right? Now again, that's really not possible. The church didn't have the ability, you might say, to do that until the 4th century. So that's the first time you can really start to see the Bible as a single book being brought together under one cover. Now what's interesting is pretty quickly after that, they decided to go back to producing 4 Gospels, Pauline letters with Acts, Catholic letters. Sometimes they merged those two. Why did they do that? Well, because the preaching and teaching was primarily based on the Gospels. Right? Every Sunday they would read the gospel lesson, and that was a set lectionary system. And so most copies of the New Testament are the 4 Gospels. Today there's about 5,000 total manuscript copies in Greek of the New Testament, and probably 60 to 70% of those are the 4 Gospels. It's because those are the most commonly used and produced set of books. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of labor to produce a copy, so they generally produce the 4 Gospels and then occasionally produce the others. But it's the 4th century where you start to see this all put together under one cover. That manuscript is probably about that thick. You stack it all up together, and again, pretty large format. So you and I would not have been able to afford one of these, right? It's just not in our budget. So I mentioned this already. Should follow my slides. Here's one of the earliest lists of New Testament writings. It's essentially the first table of contents in a manuscript. This one dates to about 400 AD. It's in the Codex Alexandrinus, and it's kind of cool. It says, and again, I can't really point to it, but if you go at this line, you see it's a little bit darker right there. It says, He Kaine Diatheke, the New Testament. And then it gives a list of books. Gospels, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. Acts of the Apostles, Catholic Epistles 7, Pauline Epistles 14, because they threw Hebrews in there, Revelation of John. So it's the first time you see in a manuscript the table of contents that lists out the New Testament writings. Now again, what's interesting is even though you don't see a list like this until 400, and a little bit early in some letters and things like that, it's the same books that they're using in 100, 110, 150. In other words, they didn't change their mind 200 years later. It's the same writings, okay? And it's a pretty important distinction to make again, because you often hear it said that, well, they didn't decide fully until the 4th century. Well, okay, technically that's true, but all the writings they're using in the 4th century are the same ones that they're using earlier, okay? So it's not an innovation, it's a summarizing that they're doing at this point. Okay. So to summarize, which books they selected. All right. If you could flip a slide for me. There we go. First, the copying of the New Testament writings is shaped by the material and the format that was used, as well as the content. So it's working side by side, right? You've got the gospel message, you've got the apostolic teaching and preaching as the content, and then you've got papyrus and later on parchment put together in book format that's working together as it develops. The initial books of the New Testament, physical books, would have been Paul's letters and the 4 Gospels as kind of 2 volumes, you might say, of the New Testament. Other writings, like the Catholic epistles, the book of Revelation, eventually were brought into those 2 books when they could expand it out technologically into the larger codex format. And there are other writings that circulated independent of the letters and the Gospels, right? Which ended up not being part of the New Testament. So what you have going on at the same time is you've got an expanding. You've got Paul's letters, the 4 Gospels, and then you get James, you get Revelation, you get Hebrews, you get 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. There's an expanding, but at the same time there's an excluding of other writings. So Gospel of Judas never occurs in a manuscript with any New Testament writing. Gospel of Thomas never occurs in a manuscript with any New Testament writing. Okay. So again, while it's not settled technically until the 4th century, it's not like they were still debating whether or not to use the Gospel of Judas. It never shows up in any manuscript. It never shows up in any church father. It never shows up in any sermon in the first 400 years. Even as there's this expanding of the New Testament until it's settled finally, there's at the same time this excluding of other writings that clearly don't match the message of the New Testament writings. Okay. So this slight expanding but also excluding of other writings until we get to what we call the New Testament. So that's the 27 books we could say are settled by the 4th century. Then they had to keep copying them. Okay? So which books ended up in the New Testament? Another issue is what is the wording of those books? Right? What words ended up in those books? So how did they copy the New Testament? And this is the fun stuff. This is what Pastor Cook spent years working on just to get his master's thesis, which is what makes him a great pastor, right? Yeah. So how do they copy the New Testament? And again, I'm going to quote my buddy Augustine here in the 4th century. So when I don't have, is there an ESV down here somewhere? You got a Bible in your church, Sam? Yeah. Just kidding. Right. So you got a Lutheran Study Bible there? I do. Even better, right? So if Pastor Bobby says, turn to page 1471 in your Bible, right? There's another one, right? Is that a Lutheran Study Bible? Close enough, right? If he says, turn to page 1471, first column, third line, second word, and you all had the Lutheran Study Bible, it would be identical, right? Because that edition is mass-produced and every copy is identical to each other because we have the technology to do that. For the first 1,500 years of the church's life, we didn't have that technology. Every copy had to be produced by hand, which meant that every copy was going to be different, right? So when Augustine, this theologian in the year 400, sits down to write a sermon or a treatise, he has in front of him a handmade object, right? And when he looks at that, he understands that there's going to be mistakes because it was copied by hand. So he says in one of his writings here, those who are anxious to know the Scriptures ought in the first place to use their skill in the correction of the copies so that the uncorrected one should give way to the corrected. So again, Augustine has a manuscript, a handmade, a handwritten copy in front of him, and anything produced by hand is going to be different. One example I like to use is my grandmother decided to make all 13 of us grandkids a quilt that all matched, right? So we all had the same quilt. And she used the same pattern, same fabric, mostly. I think she had to change the last couple, but same pattern, same fabric. And if you hung those 13 quilts up along the wall and stood here, they're going to look identical, right? Same pattern, same shapes, same wheels, you know how all that works, right? But if you walked up to each quilt and counted the number of stitches on each little circle, are they going to be identical? No, right? Because it's made by hand. That's part of what makes it valuable. Frankly, my grandmother made that. It's her hands that pulled the stitches, right? And so inevitably, even though they're identical, they're going to be different. Well, that's a pretty good analogy to what we have in the copies of the New Testament. You're going to have letters that are different, words that are different here and there. Sometimes words are moved around a little bit, substitutions. But if you step back and read the whole thing, it looks like the same text, right? So Augustine, when he sits down and writes his sermons, he says, you know what, I understand that my copy in front of me probably has a few extra stitches here or there, or they lost some stitches there. So I want to make sure it's accurate before I begin my teaching and my preaching. So what are some of the questions that come up in this area today in the making of the copies? Well, you're probably most familiar with differences between the King James translation and modern translations, right? So things like the ending of Mark. Does it end at verse 8 of chapter 16, or does it end at verse 20? Okay. Some manuscripts end Mark at verse 20, some manuscripts end at verse 8. And the King James, when they translated that, all the manuscripts that they knew about ended at verse 20, so that's where they ended it. 150 years ago, they found manuscripts that ended at verse 8. And so your modern translations will have a footnote that says something like, the oldest manuscripts of Mark's Gospel end at verse 8, but many other manuscripts add verses 9 through 20. It'll have some kind of footnote like that. Okay. You have a similar issue with the woman caught in adultery in John 7 and 8. Again, when they produced the King James, all the manuscripts they knew about had the woman caught in adultery. Manuscripts that were discovered later from the 4th century and from the 2nd century don't have those verses. So modern editions will have a footnote saying that earliest manuscripts don't include those verses. There's also new manuscript discoveries. They keep finding new fragments of manuscripts here and there, new pieces, and this adds to our knowledge. So sometimes there's adjustments to the text. There's also debates these days, theologically. And sometimes people will argue that there were changes made to the text theologically to meet changing views. A good example is the passage in 1 Corinthians 14, which says, and it's a challenging passage, what does it actually mean? Let the women remain silent in the churches. It is not permitted them to speak, but they are to remain in quietness. Right? Well, some scholars will argue that that was not part of the original letter of 1 Corinthians based on the fact that those passages move in a couple of manuscripts. Okay, so there's sometimes theological debates about this. And if you go through your modern translation, sometimes you'll find, quote, missing verses, where the King James edition, when they put the verses in, had a longer text. And again, later on, they discovered earlier manuscripts that didn't have those verses. And so you have sometimes gaps, like Acts 8:37. We can look at a couple examples later. So why is this a challenge, and how do scholars work through these things? Well, a couple of definitions. This field is called textual criticism. All right. And textual criticism is the discipline that seeks to restore what was originally written. So we have 5,000 copies of the New Testament. We have, let's say, 1,500 copies of the Gospel of John. But none of those 1,500 copies agree in every single word because, again, they're produced by hand. They're going to have slight differences, sometimes a little more significant differences. So if you have 1,500 copies of John's Gospel, which one or which combination of them best preserves the original text? Okay. So you're trying to reconstruct what John originally wrote. Now, I want to make a distinction here, and it's an important one, to what is often referred to as historical criticism. Historical criticism works in a different time period. Okay? Textual criticism says, John wrote this, and we got 1,500 copies. How do we restore what John originally wrote? Historical criticism, at least the way it's typically defined, is what existed before John wrote that he used in his sources to put his gospel together. Okay. So it's trying to understand the prehistory of John's gospel. And I have to say, well, without exclusion, there's no textual or documentary or manuscript evidence for that prehistory. So by and large, Lutheran scholars, at least in our church body, don't work with historical criticism because we're worried about what the authors wrote, not what was there before they wrote, if there was anything. Okay. So it's an important distinction to make. Textual criticism tries to get to what the original authors wrote. Historical criticism is worried about prehistory of a writing, and we just really don't care, frankly. We worry about what they actually wrote. So why do we have to do textual criticism again? That is, to restore the original wording of the text. First, again, we don't have any original manuscript for any book of Scripture. We just don't have any autographs, is the word typically used for that. It'd be cool if we did. We wouldn't have to do textual criticism then. We'd just be done. But we don't have the, let's say, Paul's letter to the Galatians in the original. We'd actually be able to recognize it. It would be a letter, scroll rolled up, writing on one side. There'd be a seal on it, and there'd be an addressee on the outside of it, so somebody who it was sent to. And because it's Galatians, in Galatians 6:11, where Paul says, look with what large letters I'm writing to you in my own hand, right? Which is kind of an odd phrase. Well, it's because the first 6.5 or 5.5 chapters would have been beautifully written. He would have had a copyist produce those as he's dictating and then revising to get a clean copy. And then when he gets to the end of the book, he writes in his own hand in a very unpolished, inelegant style because he's not a copyist, he's just a guy, and so he writes it out as a way to authenticate that it's actually by Paul. So we would know if we had an autograph because you'd have beautiful handwriting and then you'd have chicken scratch at the end, and that's Paul, right? But we don't have anything like that. All we have are copies, all of which have similar handwriting. Okay, so we don't have any original manuscript for any book of Scripture. Second basic problem is, again, no two manuscripts or groups of manuscripts agree in every place. So if you pick one manuscript, you are getting all the mistakes, whatever they might be, of that particular manuscript. So again, every manuscript is different from each other, and we don't have the original of any specific writing. So what textual criticism does, again, is sift through all the manuscripts of a given book and try to figure out what the proper or original wording is, passage by passage, to restore what the author had originally written. Here's my friend again, if I can pull him up. Oh, there's the quilt. Got ahead of myself. Yeah, there's my friend. Again, what I always enjoy is, as you work with the manuscripts, and Pastor Cook can attest to this, you sort of get to know the person who's copying it, right? You get to know what they tend to do. Do they tend to skip things? What kind of things do they typically trip up over? Do they tend to substitute things? I mean, each copy is produced by an actual person, and you almost kind of get a feel for who they are or what they're trying to do as they go through it. Can you back up one slide? Or did I? Oh wait, no. Get my own stuff out of order here. There's the quilt. Keep going. All right, there's our buddy. There we go. Oh, here we go. All right. One of the challenges in using manuscripts is that people actually use them, right? These manuscripts, which were very expensive to produce, difficult, hand-produced kinds of things, were used in some cases for hundreds of years. And as pastors or theologians or readers would use these things, they would fix things, right? So you can see here's this 4th century manuscript, and within 100, 150 years, they're correcting things, right? This word got left off, we're going to put this in here, add to it. When the next guy comes along and wants to make a copy of this, he has to decide, well, am I going to include only what was originally written? Am I going to include these corrections, right? He makes a choice. The next guy has to come along, make decisions, right? So there's this process of producing year after year after year of these manuscripts which were heavily used and producing these texts. Now, one thing to notice, you've got about, 13 lines of text up there. This is Ephesians 1. And in those 13 lines of text, you see, 3 places where there's a textual note. Oops, if I can go back one. There's only 3 places where there's a textual note or a potential substitution. So it's not like every other word has a problem. You got a couple things in 13 lines. I'll show you some examples later on as to the kind of changes that you typically see in the manuscripts. Now, as these were produced, you can track through what kind of things typically happen in the manuscripts, right? What were scribes doing as they're making copies? Often they're, quote, fixing mistakes. Again, keep in mind that a copyist knows that his manuscript was produced by hand and that there are probably, in fact, certainly will be various mistakes along the way. So if a copyist comes along and realizes that there's a mistake, what's he going to do? Well, he's going to fix it, right? But sometimes copyists might fix something that wasn't actually a mistake and cause additional problems, right? So keep in mind why they're doing this is not because they need to change the Bible or something like this, but it's because they want the text to be transmitted as accurately as possible, right? They want it to be as clear, as unambiguous as it possibly can. And if they see something that seems to be a mistake, well, they're going to fix it. Okay. Not because they're changing it, but because they're wanting it to be passed on accurately, faithfully, right? So they will do things like fixing grammar, right? The writers of the New Testament had various styles of Greek. Luke has pretty good Greek. 1 Peter has better Greek. Revelation has not very good Greek. And so the book of Revelation often has people fixing the grammar, right, to make it more readable, more clear, less confusing, right? Sometimes they would update language, vocabulary that gets out of date. Sometimes they'll update some of the vocabulary over the 1,500 years of copying Greek, right? Update words here and there. Sometimes they put annotations in the margins, and sometimes those would end up being copied into the text. Later on, you see as the church expands and the Byzantine church, the Eastern Orthodox church becomes larger, they produce a system of good scribes who use a consistent method. So by the time you get to the, say, 1000 AD, they've got a very good system, and the manuscripts produced are pretty close to each other. There's very little variation by the time you get to the year 1000. But again, it's because they've produced a bureaucracy to make it accurate. Right? And again, copying skills vary. As I mentioned, you can track through an individual scribe and almost predict the kind of changes or alterations that they're going to make. All right. Now, this is all, I got to admit, textual scholarship is not very exciting by and large. It's sitting down and reading letter by letter, word by word, comparing, right? It took Pastor Cook 3 years to write his thesis on one manuscript for only the Gospel of John, right? Was it worth it? Yeah. Yes, okay, it was, right? But it's this very slow, detailed, painstaking work, and it kind of cracks me up sometimes how people make a big deal out of it, because it's actually not very exciting. But that's what you're doing. You're tracking with what a copyist is doing and what kind of changes did they typically make. So how do scholars do the trying to put this all back together? Well, generally they're going to want to work with the earliest manuscripts, right? Because there's less chance that these were altered along the way. By and large, these manuscripts were discovered in sort of backwards order. So at the time of the Reformation, when they first printed the Greek New Testament, and Luther did his translation from the Greek New Testament, they had access to manuscripts from the 11th century to the 15th century. They didn't know that they were older manuscripts. They didn't have access to older manuscripts. So the editions used by Luther, by Tyndale, by King James, the King James translators, all were based on Greek manuscripts from the 10th, well, really 11th to the 16th century. So fairly recent in the copying tradition. The revised version, which came out in 1880, by that point they had discovered manuscripts that go back to the 4th century. So the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, we had the picture up there earlier, those weren't discovered until the 1840s. So then they have to say, well, these are now 700 years older than the ones we had previously. Are these more accurate? And scholars at that time determined that the manuscripts in the 4th century, and it makes pretty good sense, are more accurate by and large than those from the later period. Shortly afterward, in the early 20th century and on now into the 21st, they've been discovering manuscripts that go back into the 2nd century. Oops, go back one. So the papyrus manuscripts that we now use going back into the 2nd century weren't known until about 100 years ago. And they're still actually discovering more generally fragmentary small manuscripts, pieces of manuscripts. But again, when they produced the King James and when Luther did his translating, they didn't have access to 2nd century manuscripts because they hadn't been discovered yet. So that's why sometimes translations change, because there's simply more evidence, older evidence available, and the wording is sometimes a little bit different. So how do scholars figure this out? Let me give you the quick run through of this. Generally, scholars want to use older manuscripts, right? Makes sense. There's fewer copies in between the original and, say, a 4th century manuscript than there is between the original and a 12th century manuscript. It just kind of makes sense. There's less chance for alterations to be made. However, scholars also have to keep in mind, sorry, he's clicking, I'm clicking, and we're fighting each other. Even the oldest manuscripts will sometimes have mistakes. Not any single manuscript has a perfectly transmitted text. Okay? So generally, older is better. And in your modern translations like the ESV, the NIV, they have generally chosen in pretty much every case to use the manuscripts from the 2nd to the 4th century in preference to manuscripts from the 11th to the 15th century. So that's why you see differences to, say, the King James Version, because they've chosen older classic manuscripts like a Ferrari, right? All right. What's another principle they use? Generally, if you could click for me, generally, they want to use manuscripts or a reading that is in a lot of manuscripts rather than only 1 or 2, right? Again, it kind of makes sense. One manuscript is likely to make a mistake. 1,500 are not likely to make a mistake. Okay, it's just kind of the odds of things. However, again, one of the challenges is the vast majority of manuscripts were copied after the 10th century and really go back to a single edition. So even though you have, say, 1,400 copies of John's Gospel from 1100 to 1500, they really count as a single manuscript because they're all produced from a single exemplar, right? So it's sort of like, do you want to have 15 Yugos, right? Or do you want to have one Ferrari? Let's see if my Ferrari comes up. Right. Yeah, there's your Ferrari. So you got to pick, right? Do you want the numbers or do you want the classic in a sense? And sometimes those are competing points of decision, right? You have to decide, go with the majority or go with the oldest. A third criteria that scholars use in producing an edition, a Greek New Testament, is they try to find or figure out which reading, which wording best fits the author's vocabulary or theology or grammatical style. And they're basically asking the question, could the author have written that? So each author has their own writing style, their own kind of vocabulary. And sometimes it becomes obvious that a reading was introduced that doesn't match the author's vocabulary or his grammatical style. Now that's a little less easy to determine. There's a little more kind of, I guess you'd say subjectivity in determining that, but that's one of the criteria that scholars use. Does it fit, say, John's vocabulary, or does it fit Luke's vocabulary, or is it reflective of a later period, is a criteria. The basic rule or basic principle that they're using is they're trying to determine which reading or which wording was original and which one is secondary, which one gave rise to the other reading, is a common way to say it. So is it more likely that an author wrote this and it was changed to that, or that he wrote that and it was changed to this? Let me give you one example, and I can't believe I didn't bring my Greek text, but it's in the room. If you have a Bible, turn to Mark 1, verse 2. So it's a pretty simple example that doesn't make a whole lot of theological difference. You got a Greek text, Tim, on you? Oh, I see. All right. I got one. It's okay. I got it memorized. So Mark 1, verse 2 is, you got 1 verse 1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, Son of God. As it is written, and your translation says, as it is written in, what does it say? Isaiah the prophet, right? Look at the next verse, and it says, Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight, right? Something like that. Oh, look, I am sending my messenger before your face. Sorry, I skipped to the next one, right? Look, I am sending my messenger before your face. Now, if you have in the margins, that verse is a citation not of Isaiah, but a citation of Malachi. And then you get to the next verse, and it's Isaiah 40, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight, right? So you got what looks like a problem, right, as it says in Isaiah the prophet, and then it quotes Malachi. So what do some manuscripts do? Anybody have a King James Bible on them? Right. What a lot of manuscripts do, in fact, is they substitute for, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, it says, as it says in, and you could probably guess, as it says in the prophets, right? Problem solved. Quotes Malachi, quotes Isaiah, everything's good, right? Now, what we now know is that in the ancient world, when you cite multiple authors in a row, you don't use our modern Turabian system or Chicago manual style and give a footnote to each. You either reference the most important author or you reference the last one cited. And so what does Mark do? Well, he quotes Isaiah, who, in the Super Bowl would probably beat Malachi, right? And, I'm kidding. And he's the last one cited. So what Mark is doing what a first century writer would do, but to later correctors, well, let's fix it to say, as it says in the prophets. Okay. So that's an example of kind of fixing what are perceived to be mistakes. And it's very unlikely that a 5th century or 6th century copyist would change the prophets to Isaiah the prophet. Probably not going to happen. But it's pretty understandable to see how a scribe would change in Isaiah the prophet to the prophets, because it solves a perceived problem. Right? And again, it's a perceived problem, not a real problem. So those are the kind of changes or kind of ways that scholars analyze manuscripts to try to figure out what the original actually was. Okay? You've got manuscripts that say one thing, and you got manuscripts that say another thing in exactly the same place. Right? They both can't be right. So how do they figure out which one was actually written by Mark? Okay, that's what textual scholarship does. Now, if you can skip ahead about 4 slides, how big of a problem is this? And keep in mind that scholars like to find the problems and point them out, right? That's kind of the job of scholars. The reality is there's remarkable consistency in wording. So let me give you one example. Here's Romans 3, famous passage on the gospel that we use on Reformation Day, and I've put in italics every place where any manuscript, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, whatever, has any difference in wording. Okay, let me read you, and I'll highlight the places that have any differences. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been revealed, having been testified in the law and prophets. So far, no changes, right? The righteousness of God is revealed through faith in Jesus Christ. So it's either in Christ or in Jesus Christ. Those are the 2 options. For all and upon all is a variant, who believe. For there is no distinction, all have sinned and lack the glory of God, having been justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood. See, no differences in any manuscript anywhere for those 3 lines. A couple of manuscripts add here through this faith, but then it keeps going, as a demonstration of his righteousness by, in the forbearance of God, passing over earlier sins as a demonstration of his righteousness as a present time, so that he might be just, and then there's an option. Some manuscripts say, and the one who justified, or some have a participle, by justifying, the one who has faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? A couple of manuscripts say, where then is your boasting? It is excluded by which law? By a law of works? No, but by a law of faith. And then you have a single letter difference for we determine or let us determine. It's a single letter difference. That one is justified either by or through faith, single word difference, apart from works of the law. Now, again, as you read through that, that's every single manuscript of Romans with every single difference in the manuscripts, right? At the end of the day, how different is it if you pick every possible variation, right? It's really not any different, right? It doesn't say, the righteousness of God is revealed through, jumping on a trampoline or, something. There's nothing like that, right? It's very subtle differences. Again, the difference of, going up to a quilt and counting the number of stitches that you see overall. So one thing to keep in mind again is that the manuscript tradition is, for its 1,500 years of copying history, remarkably consistent. Right? You can use a New Testament produced in 1516 and a New Testament produced in 2017, and virtually the same thing, remarkably consistent. And in fact, I sometimes do it just for the fun of it. I'll grab a random Greek New Testament and use it, work from it, and it, in many ways, doesn't make any difference at all. So that's the first key thing to keep in mind, is that the differences in wording are very slight. In fact, you have less difference in wording among Greek New Testaments from the Reformation to today than you'd have in comparing the ESV to the NIV. There's less difference. There's more difference in modern translations because of translation variations, which we'll talk about. Second thing to point out is our manuscripts that we have today actually carry features that can be traced back to the original letters. I mentioned earlier the Galatians 6:11 example, where we have Paul's chicken scratch handwriting, but we actually have several markers of items that would be in the original autograph and really have no meaning or significance apart from the original autograph. So 5 times Paul uses a phrase like this. Say in 1 Corinthians 16:21, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Right? And again, in the autograph, in the original letter, that would have been chicken scratch. Right? If Paul had a backup copy, let's say, and that was what was used for producing the edition, that wouldn't be there. Right? Those words wouldn't be there. The only place that would be is in the letter that got sent to Corinth. Yet we have that in our manuscripts. So what that tells us is that we have in our manuscript tradition, in our copies, it goes as far back as you can possibly go. It has features that connect them directly to the original writings for the Apostle Paul. They haven't been redacted or heavily edited, but they have features of the original writings themselves. So there's not this sort of gap between the original writings and the earliest copies. And finally, as I mentioned, we keep finding new manuscripts, fairly fragmentary. This is a good example. This is P123. It was first published in 2009, I believe it was, 2009 or 2010. And it's pretty small. You see about 6 lines, and it's pretty fragmentary. Of 1 Corinthians 14, you flip it over, it's 1 Corinthians 15. And it's significant because, as I mentioned earlier, there's some scholars who argue that the passage about the women remaining silent in the churches is not actually by Paul, even though it occurs in every manuscript. Okay. When this was published, I was kind of curious to see what would happen. I knew it was coming, but I didn't. I heard from a friend of mine that it was coming out. Would those verses occur? Was a big question. And in fact, you can see there's epitreptai. It's all right there, exactly where it should be. There's nothing new or unusual in the manuscript. And here's the point: you didn't hear anything about this manuscript, right? Why did you not hear anything about this manuscript? Because it matches exactly what we knew before. Now, had this manuscript lacked those 2 verses, I guarantee it would have been on every news show, every magazine, everything, right? Because it changes everything we knew before. The reality is, the more manuscripts we find, the more consistent we find the wording to be. That is, we keep finding new pieces of manuscripts like this, and it matches with what we knew before. Oh yeah, there's slight wording things here and there, those are to be expected. But we're not finding completely different versions of the New Testament writings. Okay? And again, one of my complaints about the way the media works and TV shows is they over-sensationalize and only pick out the weird things, the very occasional weird things. And you never hear about things like this where, well, it's just what we knew before. It's just what we knew before. It's just what we knew before. Since 1979, when they last did a revision of the Greek New Testament before the most recent one, they've discovered about, let me add it up, about 40 additional manuscripts from the 2nd to the 5th century. And not a single one of them changes anything in the edition. Right? So again, the more manuscripts that are found, the more consistent scholars are finding the text. And more recent research is finding that even the later manuscripts have a better text than what was previously thought. So it's one of the ironies that the more research scholars are doing, the more consistent they're finding the text to be. And it's sort of the opposite of what is often portrayed, again, that there's these kind of strange finds and everything's different. Okay. So just to sum this up, there are places, especially between, say, the King James and modern editions, where there are differences in wording. That's because when the King James was produced, they didn't have access to earlier manuscripts. Okay? Later on, they found these manuscripts, and it pushed the evidence earlier and earlier. But we sort of reached a point where the additions, the newer finds, are not changing things anymore. Right? We're reached kind of a tipping point where there's enough manuscript evidence that it seems to be pretty consistent. And I think we're in well, we'll see, but the newer editions are pretty consistent among themselves. So we're at dinner time, and I went through that pretty quick, but any quick questions, or should we hold off? Pastor Bobby, should we just go? Yeah. Let's just go. All right, catch me at dinner, or we'll do some Q&A at the end. Thanks.